So when it comes to balancing equations, I like to start on the left and count each element and balance each element as I go along. So in this case I'm going to start with BR. So if I count my BRs, on the left of the arrow I've got 2, and on the right of the arrow over here I've got 1. So I'm going to balance that out before I move on. So I'm going to do that by popping a big 2 in front. That multiplies this whole chunk here by 2, so I've now got 2 BRs. The next thing I come to is NA. On the left hand side here I've got 1 NA. On the right hand side I've got 2 because I've doubled this whole chunk, so that 2 applies to the NA as well. So to balance that out I'm going to want to pop a 2 in front of here. I've now got 2 NAs. The next element I come to is my I. On the left I've got 2 because I've times it by 2 with that balancing number, and on the right hand side I've got 2 because it's an I2 molecule. So that equation is now balanced. Now here I've got an equation that I'd like to show you something I call chunking. I don't think it really has a proper name. So we've got an SO4 here, and that SO4 has stayed as SO4. So rather than counting the sulfurs and the oxygens separately, you can cheat a little bit and just count them as SO4 chunks. So if I balance that using this here, if I start on the left as before, I've got my Ks. I've got 1 K there and 2 Ks there. So I'm going to want to pop a big 2 in front here to double that whole chunk. The next thing I come to is my O. Now I'm not going to include the O's in the SO4 chunks. So on this side I've got 2, and on the right hand side I've just got 1 in my water. So I'm going to want to pop a 2 in front of my water to double those oxygens. The next thing I come to is my hydrogens. On the left I've got 4, be very careful here because I've got 2 in the KOH because I've doubled that, and I've got 2 in my H2SO4, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 altogether. And on the right hand side I've got 2 lots of H2 in the water, so I've got 4. So that's balanced already. The next thing I come to then is my SO4 chunk. I've got 1 SO4 chunk on this side and 1 SO4 chunk on that side, so that one is balanced. This is another example for you that includes a bit of chunking, if you like. In this case it's my NO3 that I can chunk because it hasn't changed, it stayed the same on both sides of the equation. I've also got some formulas here, formulae that include brackets. So I'm going to start on the left as before, so I'm going to start with my Mgs. On the left hand side I've got 1, and on the right hand side I've got 1. The next thing I come to is my NO3 chunk. I've got 2 of them here. The little 2 applies to everything within the brackets. So I've got 2 of those chunks, and on the right hand side here I've just got 1. So what I'm going to want to do is pop a big 2 in front there. So I've now got 2 NO3 chunks on each side. Moving over, I come to my Na. I've got 1 on the left, and I've got 2 over here on the right because that balancing number that we put in for the NO3 chunk applies to everything. So I'm going to want to pop a 2 on that side. Next thing I come to is my oxygens, remembering not to count the ones in the NO3 chunks, we've already sorted those out. So I've got 2 oxygens here, and on this side of the arrow I've got 2 oxygens because this little 2 after the bracket applies to everything within the bracket. Next thing I come to is my hydrogens. I've got 2 here because that balancing number applies to that whole chunk, and then on this side I've got 2 because the little 2 after the brackets applies to everything within the brackets. So that equation is now balanced.